In 1940, I went in, Armored Corps. I took my training at Camp Borden. By November, I was in England. We were sent to Italy. I was on staff, which meant that I was into action at Cassino and at Ortona, places like that, long before my regiment. I came home in July or August of 1944, badly wounded, and my parents threw a big party and all their friends came to welcome me back. And they were talking about how hard it was to get gasoline and how hard it was to get sugar and how you couldn't get a good maid. These were my father's social circles. I listened that evening for maybe 30 minutes. I couldn't take it. I left. Why was I upset? When your best friend's lying there and you see his guts on the ground, you know you can't help him. He's going to die. You can't come back without being affected. Everybody. Some of us recovered, some didn't. Those who reached their limit, and it's a little bit like a bank account. You can keep drawing on it, but eventually there's no more left.
Band leader Peter Barry was transferred from a combat unit to help entertain Canadian troops in Amsterdam waiting to be shipped home.
I was in Holland during the liberation of Holland, and I remember that I would see these people with Semitic features, and they'd be walking down the road. Now, they weren't necessarily in concentration camps. They had been hiding out and been hidden by the Dutch people, who I thought were absolutely tops. And I shall never forget this Jewish man stopping me in Amsterdam, and he said, "Bist hij Yid?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Mein Liberator." And he threw his arms around me. And, you know, it really tore me up. I asked him about himself, and he said, "I've been living in this old barn, in this field, for a couple of years there." And he was wearing like rags around his feet because he had no shoes, or no proper shoes. So I gave him a pair of my army boots, and in order he wouldn't be caught with them, I cut them off and made them into, you know, slippers. And then I invited him to see a show. He said it was the first show he had seen since the invasion.
H.M. Kaiserman, General Secretary of the Canadian Jewish Congress, saw Jewish soldiers who had fought with the Red Army or the partisans. He also visited children in transit.
On this pitiable remnant of Jewry in Europe depends the future of the Jewish people in the world. You all feel the dignity of the Jewish name. You treasure it. Our work must continue. It must be increased in the months to come. Our brothers and sisters call to us. We must not fail.
Montreal Jews sent food and clothing.
They brought a group of orphans to Canada from Europe after the war. In fact, we took one girl to live with us. When the Germans started to invade Russia, her father was a doctor, and he changed her name, and she moved to a farm in Russia. She was 11 years old then. Her father and mother and two brothers were shot by the Germans. She came with a group of orphans that the Canadian Jewish Congress had arranged to come from. She was living in France at the time. A friend of mine recommended her. She had interviewed her with a group of girls, and I had the same group of girls come to my house. She wanted to be educated, and that pleased me, and I took her for 5 years until she got married.
Many orphans waited years for permission to come to Canada. Many others were denied entry.
During the war, I survived the war under an assumed name. As a kid, I was 12 years old when I assumed that name, which was not mine. My father got me a birth certificate, so that was more or less the ground was prepared. And with that birth certificate, I started out to Warsaw. And Warsaw, through all kinds of trials and tribulations, which almost seem incredible to me now, I found a first job from a ad in the paper that they're looking for a helper, and orphans welcome, and that's how I got my first job. And then after a few months, I felt that I was an experienced assistant maid, and that I could go on. If I would go into the store to buy bread or something, and the lady where the stores were always the headquarters of all the rumors, gossip, whatever, very valid information, very valuable for me, who was living with my ears always to the ground when I slept and one eye open, because my life depended on it. And she would say, let's say something like, oh, did you see that new governess? I think it's a peroxide Jew with dyed hair. I don't know what's happening to our district. That's a regular Palestine. That meant that I have to get out as quickly as I can without attracting attention through getting out.
When the war was over, there was a mass movement of survivors across Europe.
My only surviving relative, my aunt, my mother's sister, was looking for me. But I had not registered in any Jewish institution, any committee or nothing, so it was very difficult to look for me. Ultimately, my aunt came to Lodz to fetch me and said, well, I have to resume the kind of normal life, which means going to school, and study was something that always both attracted and amused me. I received a letter from the American government that they're creating a separate quota for children under 18 who are war orphans. In the orphanage, I found out that there were some changes in the immigration laws. I had to be in Germany in 1945 in order to qualify. I said, well, I wasn't, so you brought me here, what do you want? Would you go to Canada? There is a commissioner or somebody who came in, they're ready to take kids. The Jewish Congress is sponsoring. I said, by all means. It didn't make much of a difference to me.
They started arriving in September 1947. As a matter of fact, I met the first group that came into Halifax, and I remember it was shortly before Rosh Hashanah, probably a day or two, and I was anxious to get them to Montreal before the holidays, before Rosh Hashanah. So I flew to Halifax three times in one day on the plane and bring them back here.
My father once wanted to adopt one of these young girls that came over here. And my mother, she was living with us. My mother had a great heart. She was okay. Chaya Sura, her name was. And he wanted to adopt this girl. And my mother said, oh no. She's not my child. She's not my child. And then she insisted that the child leave, and the child went into an orphan's home to Jean Mance.
I was born in Miskolc, and as a child I was sent to Budapest to go to school, elementary school. And then the ghetto was a tough place. It was a tough place to survive. We were bombarded. And then when the Russians approached, it was artillery. An 11-year-old, you were aware of some things. I'll tell you what I was very much aware of is the safe houses, and I was in there for a while.
Zionist youth operating underground set up these places of refuge and organized food supplies for thousands of Jews throughout the siege.
It was not in the ghetto, but it wasn't all that safe. And, well, I wasn't there that long, but the fighting came close. And then we were chased out of there too. Out of the safe houses weren't so safe, but that was at the end.
After liberation by the Red Army, Andrei and other hidden children were brought to Austria for school and rehabilitation.
I came from a DP camp in Germany. My parents were survivors from Poland. And after the war, they came here because my father's father had come here, I think in the late 20s. And I guess he sponsored my father and his family, which was me and my mother. I was really, I guess I was watched all the time. They never let me ride a bicycle. They never let me go too far from the house.
Did you realize why?
No, I didn't. I just thought my parents were weird. I mean, I was a kid. I wanted to be like everybody else, you know.
I later found out that Max's mother had handed a baby to her father and never saw the baby or her father again. He didn't know this all the time that he was growing up.
She never told me about the fact that she had had a family before the war.
I ended up in Montreal. I was supposed to go to Regina, but I didn't know where Regina was, and I put up a fuss, and the leader took an eraser and erased on a yellow sheet somebody's name from Montreal, put him to Regina. We were taken to, on Jean Mentz, there was the Herzl Center. We were given a card, J. Schrader on St. Lawrence. So I show up at Schrader's, and Joe grabs me because he was of Hungarian origin as well. And immediately, like, he wanted to hear, he had a million questions which I answered, and take this and take that. I could barely walk out of there. He was the most generous man. And then I was invited to a Brownstein's for a Friday night dinner. And then at the end of the dinner, Mrs. Brownstein asked me if I'd like to stay with them. And I said yes.
You were legally adopted?
I was not legally adopted, but in every other sense of being adopted and being a brother, I was, and I am. You know, I put myself back in time, who would adopt a youngster when they already had all the kids out of the house except for my youngest brother, Erwin. When I graduated high school, I went to work in one of the stores, and Brown's shoe stores. I became manager in the store in Queen Mary, which became a very busy store because it's where Côte St. Luc started to come into existence. While I was working in the store, I met Esther, and who was my dear wife, and it's a fairy tale from there on.
There was like a community on St. Urbain at that time. There were a lot of immigrants on St. Urbain and a lot of survivors who came. And they stuck together, yeah. I remember a lot of times, like friends of my mother and father coming into the house, and this, you know, I remember them telling stories of what they went through during the war, but they kept it within that little community.
We knew, let's say, that east of St. Lawrence, you never went alone because there was the McGuire Street gang. So you always went in twos. The street that I lived on was a real mixture of Jewish boys, Catholics, Protestants, French Canadians, you name it. We were all friends. And we were a gang. The racial, ethnic factor didn't play a role at all. I mean, if you were in a scrap, you were in a scrap. That's all there is to it. But we all knew that there were certain things you didn't do. As for example, you never scheduled a hockey game between or a baseball game between 4 and 5:30 because most of the Jewish kids went to afternoon school. You went to Cheder. So they knew that you couldn't schedule it at that time. We never scheduled any programs Sunday morning because we knew that the church was a factor, and this is the way we lived together.
In Montreal, newcomers discovered Jewish schools and services and Yiddish-speaking labor and cultural organizations similar to those they might have joined in pre-war Europe. There were groups of every persuasion: liberal, socialist and communist, Zionist and non-Zionist, religious and secular, social clubs and sports clubs. Youngsters went to the Y or to neighborhood house.
Zionisten, die Bundisten, die Kommunisten, we were all arguing till we were blue in the face about how to make a better world.
Well, we went to Volksschule in the day school. We were both so-called scholarship children. In other words, we didn't pay, okay? And I remember in grade 6, Habonim already sent a minahelet for us, and we started having meetings in Volksschule, grade 6 and 7. So naturally, we were Habonim.
Many teens joined Zionist youth movements, such as Hashomer Hatzair, Habonim, and Bnei Akiva, which encouraged, each in its own way, an enlightened worldview and a commitment to building the new Jewish state as kibbutz pioneers. Their camps were places for enjoying summer, discovering nature, and strengthening bonds to one another and to their ideals.
At the time, I think Shomer HaTzair was the strongest. Habonim came a nice second, and Shomer HaDati, which became Bnei Akiva, was the third. But we felt we had things in common because Israel was the big one.
The Habonim and the Shomer got along. We used to have our, little disagreements, but by and large, we got along. They were a little bit more left than we, and what does that mean? I don't know, except they had more rules, they were more
They
strict.
had more rules, yes. Yeah. And I was a member of Habonim, and I sort of got to like the boys in the Shomer more. So I came home one day and announced, I'm leaving Habonim, I'm going to Shomer. My mother said to me, if you join the Shomer, don't bother to come home, you're not my daughter anymore. And that was that.
Bnei Akiva and the religious, the Dati, the Orthodox, however you want to call them, were part of the general, the mainstream. And we all adhered because our homes were very strongly Orthodox at the time. So we could afford to mix with others, and we all knew where our home base was. Israel at that time meant Hakshama, which meant realization, and Hakshama, realization, meant living on kibbutz. The kibbutz philosophy, the idea where we will have that egalitarian society, all of this was part of the general picture. And my leaders who left in 48, all of them went to kibbutz. I don't remember that the rabbis had much say on that. The issue was still much bigger. It was like Eretz Yisrael. We're going back to Eretz Yisrael after almost 2,000 years. And that was good enough for them. They weren't going into the details then. Everything was laudatory. Everything was worthwhile. They weren't picky about it.
Friday night we used to dance. At that time we were still on Esplanade Street. You get 40, 50 people doing the horror. The building has to be pretty strong. Let me tell you, those buildings, the new buildings wouldn't have survived. I remember distinctly Mordechai Richler was in Habonim. And if you read one of his books, he's talking about why was he in Habonim? Because he was told the girls were allowed to stay up past 10 o'clock.
But you know, thinking back to Habonim again, we became a little bit politicized there. I can remember when we were helping A.M. Klein in his campaign to get elected, and we stuffed envelopes with his flyers.
UJPO, the fraternal organization, fostered social justice and Yiddish culture.
My dad was Secretary General of UJPO. One time, it was in 1952, I was 10 years old at that time. He brought me to the building and he took a look and he showed me that a padlock, a lock with a bronze chain wound around the metal door. And he went over to it and he shook the door with both hands and he said to me in Yiddish, he says, "Zindale, dus is Duplessis." And it wasn't until much later that I realized he was talking about the Maurice Duplessis, then Premier of the province of Quebec.
The UJPO schools were named for Morris Winchevsky, a renowned socialist, journalist, and poet. UJPO provided many services, including camps, choirs, and drama groups, and was informally linked to the Communist Party.
My mother was a teacher at the Winchevsky School from the end of the war till it closed in 1952. The cops pulled up one day. She said to the children as she saw the cops entering the building, "It's a school holiday, but just go out the door quickly."
This was an extension of the Red Scare that spread across North America in the late 40s.
We sort of realized we weren't going to make Aliyah. We became involved in B'nai B'rith, and I particularly was very active at the various levels in B'nai B'rith, and that was a very nice experience. And it was a lot of fun. I went to a lot of Friday night dances in a lot of different schools as the DJ.
You had dances. The YMHA would have dances. We had dances were part of the social life. I mean, money we didn't have, so you had to find a cheap way of entertaining yourself.
The end it always with Stardust. That was the last song of the evening. At the Y anyway, I don't know.
Everywhere. Newcomers were getting jobs in the needle trade.
The organized labor movement was opposed to immigration because immigration was used as a source of bringing indentured laborers to Canada. When they built the CPR, the transcontinental railways, and they brought in the Chinese, the first thing we did was to develop a program which we said that admission to Canada should be based only on the absorptive capacity of the country. We got together, the Canadian Labour Congress, the Canadian Jewish Congress, the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society. We got them to send, we got through McNamara, the Deputy Minister of Labour, and the others, to instruct the Canadian immigration officials in occupied Europe at that time, and in Britain and in France, to cooperate with a tripartite delegation from Canada. They formed the trade unions and the manufacturers. Then, of course, the immigration officials began putting, sort of boycotting the whole effort, and it almost collapsed on several occasions.
I went from the Thorns, from probably Pine Avenue approximately, all the factories, and asked them whom they want. And they told me. And we told them, well, if you have a job for them, you'll accept them. If you have no job, we will not hold you responsible, this kind of a thing, which was perfectly legal.
But don't forget that those people triggered another wave of immigration. Relatives whom they brought in. And we got special permits. One time we got 70, another time we got 60 people. The only thing we had to do is to get people in Canada who were established, who said that they would look after those people. Sponsor them. And the Jewish Labor Committee became a sponsor.
It was agreed that we'll give employment to as many workers as is humanly possible that could be brought into the workforce. And based upon the decision of the Jewish Labor Committee, in cooperation with the Canadian Jewish Congress, in cooperation with the Canadian government at that time, delegations were sent down to bring in cloak makers, dressmakers, men's clothing workers, and in the case I'm talking about where I was directly involved, hat workers, cap workers. I was able to get 200 families here, roughly about 600 souls. That was the minimum that we can possibly do. Unfortunately, there was no other way of bringing them all to a country where people are searching for peace and fraternity and democracy and freedom.
In 1941, when the Germans invaded Russia, a 21-year-old Jewish soldier from Poland joined the move to the Ural Mountains. At the factory where he worked as a tailor for the army, he met his future wife. At the end of the war, the young couple returned to Poland with their baby and soon moved to a DP camp in Salzburg. His skill as a tailor would be the key to a new life in Montreal.
They sent people from the unions checking us that we were really tailors. Some tailors and me too. We did this for other people, you know, for ourselves, for other people. Some gebriefde Menschen, sie sind tailors, und sie haben erklärt jeden einen, they are all right, they are tailors, they could come to Canada. There were many. We waited there for ships, so that's the way we come to Canada. First of all, we get to get a room. They rent for us a room the first month to the Jayas here in Montreal. I got enough money to rent an apartment. I rent an apartment on Clark Street after 15 months being in a room. So I needed money, you know, to pay for key money, they called it at the time. $500 for a broken kitchen table and 4 broken chairs. I went to the union and I couldn't get much help from the union because they sent me small places. Today they were in business. 2 months later, went out of business. So then I found myself through the Canada Adler. I found myself the first better job. But it was a hard time for everybody.
I really do believe that the Jewish community, those who read the Canada Adler, looked upon the Canada Adler as a source of authority on a lot of things. We had Hirsch, we had Rabinovich there, B.G. Sack. They were all learned guys. So long as they didn't take the left-wing line, the pro-Zionist line, and the line I was satisfied with. They never submitted the editorials to me. We had reporters, Ginsburg, I don't know if you remember Ginsburg, Medras. They used to go to these Jewish functions. But for world news, we had to take it from the Star. They always say to this, how did the Star know yesterday what you're going to print today? That was the favorite joke. How did the Star know yesterday? But the Star went out too. And we had some celebrated editors in our time. They were making $30, $35 a week. They were on top of the world. A.M. Klein was the editor of the Chronicle at that time.
Do you have very good, strong memories of A.M. Klein?
Oh, he used to write his, you know, he had the highfalutin English, you know. He would never use a one-syllable word if we can use a 6-syllable word. And I would say to him, Abe, I says, why don't you write in the language that people could understand? It's almost hyperbole, you know. So he says to me, look, he says, I don't want to go down to the level of my readers. I want to bring the level of my readers up to my level over there. And you couldn't tell them anything about it.
The poet Itzik Manger was in Montreal, and he had managed to alienate everybody, of the Jewish world in Montreal. And he used to come up to our house because that's where he really had nowhere else to go. And I thought to myself, if I don't do a portrait of him, I'll have lost this opportunity. And that'll be too bad. So I set up my easel right in the middle of the dining room and so on, and I started painting. The minute he saw me looking at him, he'd get up and walk around. He didn't want to pose. He says, nobody can do my portrait. Marc Chagall tried, he didn't come out. Saul Lerner tried in London, nobody can do my portrait. At that time, he'd already in his mind, had a battle with Melech Ravitch. So what happened was that I just happened to mention Melech Ravitch's name. The minute he heard the name of Melech Ravitch, he sat down and started, railing against Ravitch. He's this and he's that, and he completely forgot about getting up and walking around. I got him. And the portrait was very good.
My father, he started reading really as soon as he came here. He had to learn English, and he started reading, and I still have somewhere, I have his little Webster pocket dictionary that he had, and he was an avid reader, and that's why he had the store, I think, so that he could sit there and just read most of the day, because nobody used to come into the store. Very few people used to come into the store.
So I went to business college, Utrecht Business College, and within 6 months, I got a job. I got my first job at Samuelson's Limited, the men's clothing. And then I went to the library, and Rochel Eisenberg says to me, I see that you're not taking Polish books anymore. I say, no, now I'm reading English. He says, why don't you read Yiddish books now? I said, please give me a break. I'm plowing through the English ones. Yiddish would take me, I don't know how long to put the words together. And Rochel told me that there is a wonderful man who's going to give some classes at the library. And she says, even you with your nose in the air, you're going to appreciate him. You just go to one class and see. And that's where I met my husband. And that was in '49.
And the wonderful teacher?
Oh, you came in Irving Layton. You would come in after a day's work. It was very easy to doze off. I mean, after being tired. He would wake you up. He would walk in with his dynamic step and voice of his. He'd walk into that class. Was incredible.
One of my teaching practices is a teaching practice that's as old as the hills, was to start the class talking. These were all, newcomers. I would start asking questions about what their lives were. What did you do during the war? That kind of thing. But instead of the usual phrase, and what did you do, Johnny, during the war? You see, but, and where were you at the time, and so on and so forth. So I got to hear these stories about the survivors, and they had a tremendous effect on me, and it got me started writing about Jews and Jewish themes that I had not paid that much attention to before. I live among the blind, the deaf, and the dumb. I live among amnesiacs. My murdered kin, let me be your parched and swollen tongue, uttering the maledictions bullets and gas silenced on your lips. Fill my ears with your direst curses. I shall tongue them unappeasable shades till the sun turns black in the sky.
I came back to Poland in 1946 because the Russians took all the people when they liberated us, and they took us to work for them. I got news that a younger sister from me is alive, and I saw her, how they took her to that block, in block 30, everybody knew that, and that they put it on fire with the people, with everybody. So I knew that I lost her. But all of a sudden, a friend of mine took me to see somebody which came from Sweden, and she told me that my sister's alive. So my sister sent a visa to us. We decided to come to Canada. They didn't make too much trouble because a Jew from Montreal, a man by the name, he was a lawyer, I think, Feigenbaum, was the sponsor for us.
No relation?
No relation, he never saw us. I bought a present for appreciation. He didn't even want to see us, he didn't want to take the present. He said, I did what they asked me to do, the rest I don't care. I don't care who they are. We arrived Friday night. That same evening, they said that in his organization there's a meeting, in the Arbeiterring, there's a meeting in Workman's Circle. Monday morning, Saturday, Sunday, he was looking for a job as a carpenter. On Monday, he went to work. We arrived Friday, Monday.
The feeling I had at the time were different of the feelings I have now. So the further you go away from that period, the more you see it, the more you think about it. We didn't have time to think at the time. We were, you know, like drunk with what some call it the freedom that we had, which I never had. I never had that feeling of freedom in Poland or in Germany until I came into Canada. And I remember when I arrived in Canada and I walked off the boat and the Canadian officer came and shook hands with me and I handed him over my passport and he said, welcome to Canada. And that, I said, that was the greatest thing I could ever hear. I'm 31 years old and the first time in my life somebody, an official, says to me, welcome. I wasn't welcome in the country I was born in. I was not welcome in the country I came back to. And my patriotism to that country has fade away. I don't have that feeling no more. If I have feelings for what we call at the time fatherland, this is my fatherland, Canada is.
In the beginning, it was a little bit to swallow, not too nice things. Or for instance, they used to say, Mrs. Feigenbaum, or somebody else, it's true, many gonna tell you. Did you, have you heard that the Germans were running away and they left everything and you took so much jewels and so much money and this and that? I'm telling you, this was something that it hurt so much because you really, you went out from this war just like you were born. I came without shoes. What should I tell you? I came to lodge and excuse me for my I came without underwear.
They expected a different attitude. They expected. And they expected within the first year or two to receive all the privileges, whether it's furniture or housing and a lot of things. Well, this wasn't there. Moreover, you do not create friendship just because the synagogue invites you to a dinner or a person invites you to a tea. There were those things. But the immigrants told me too that they were very hesitant to accept those invitations because they felt inferior. They could not reciprocate. So I guess it takes time until the integration takes place. I think the reception was good, but what they missed, as some have missed, is the personal interest in it.
In the shops, it was not easy for us. The operators were older people. Many of them were afraid. They weren't very friendly to us. One operator sitting near me in the next machine. One day my middle daughter was born, and the boss was a very fine man. He came over, he says, my wife went to the hospital to have the second child, with a friend of mine because I couldn't afford the time to go to the hospital with my wife. So he come over to say Mazel Tov to me. So the operator next to me, he didn't have any children. He turned to me and he said, at this time, you allow yourself to have children? So it weren't pretty times.
We took in a Polish girl after the war, and she lived in our house. We were very, very poor. In fact, Sam Gesser's parents were our landlords, and my parents got paid for it, I guess, and I gave up. My bedroom was just like a postage stamp, and I slept on a hide bed in the living room. And we became very close. And she was very resentful that my parents got paid for her. But we really became close, and I took her to the symphony and to the art gallery, things like that. And she seemed just very well adjusted and very normal until the night came and she went to sleep. And in her sleep, we'd hear blood-curdling yells. And yeah, she was in the woods. They found her in the woods, and she doesn't have a memory of family or anything. She's all alone. They found her, and it left its mark on her.
I slept on the floor for a year and a half while a refugee couple had my bedroom.
Do you remember them?
Oh yes, they're still alive. We're still very close friends with them.
We were 4 children in 2 little bedrooms, and there was hardly any room for, to take anyone in.
We lived in the poor working class section of Montreal, on St. Dominic Street, and we offered our double parlor, the big room of the house. They were Polish Jews. Each had had a former spouse who was killed, and children who were killed. And they met again after the war and married, and they came to Canada. It was a time when the Jews of Montreal we were very anxious to help them out and felt very strong feelings about them and heard many stories about what had happened. They couldn't understand that here we were in a country like Canada, which had so many opportunities, and we were poor people. We lived a certain kind of life where material things were not of the utmost importance. And to them it was incomprehensible because they, without not very much time, they found a place and they managed to do very well, materially well, much better anyway, in their lives.
And we found that one nephew was a survivor. And so we did everything. I mean, my parents did everything possible to bring him in. And they brought him in as my father's younger brother. And my mother was very intent that he marry and have his own family. And she did that. She did went out of her way to find a suitable young lady for him. And they did marry, and they had 3 children. But if we look at the results, the children of the parents of the Holocaust, then we knew that, boy, it didn't end with 6 million. And he was one of the few people that I knew that when Germany was ready to offer the reparation money, there was no way we could not convince him. The mental anguish that permeated his home. This is my cousin, and inevitably to the children, something unbearable. And today I know in Israel that so many people who have really made wonderful strides, so wonders with their lives, but now at the end of the day, they're old now, and they say the only thing that visits them are those years of the concentration camps. That's the memory that they really leave this world.
In the months leading to Israel's independence, new immigrants were living in tents and shacks. And Montreal volunteers helped ferry planes from Czechoslovakia for the fledgling Israeli Air Force.
We didn't have any radios, and the airport in Israel didn't have any radio either. But we knew that if we would hit Crete at nightfall, at dusk, and we would turn right 180 degrees due south, in about an hour and a half we would hit the coast, Tel Aviv. And just to the right was the airport near Rehovot. At that time it was called Akir. And that it had to be done at night. And they picked me because I'd been a night bomber pilot. Most of the other American pilots had been daylight pilots, all right? I landed there and I found out that there was one problem. Planes were supposed to come in one after the other. And propellers, when the plane landed, churned up this tremendous cloud of sand and rock. And of course the plane circling overhead couldn't come into land until all this settled down.
After a short recreation break, Novik resumed his medical studies in Canada. Most Montreal volunteers joined infantry units and were caught up in fierce fighting early in Israel's War of Independence.
We were in a gully when I was hit. It was a Bren gun. He was in a tree over a house. All he could do was see my leg, I guess. Well, he couldn't, and he was just shooting like that, and he cut it. It was being held by a few strands of
and I broke
muscle.
the door down to create a stretcher for him, to pull him out. And May 14th, before midnight, we were paraded out on the parade square at Kfar Bilu in our camp, and the state of Israel was proclaimed. I remember that night so good and clear, so beautiful, that we're having our own country at last, our own Medina.
I went in 52 to a kibbutz called Urim in the Negev, and we had quite a few Montrealers there. I think probably the highlight of my life were the 2 years prior to going on Aliyah, when I spent it on Hachshara in Smithville, Ontario. This is where you took a city kid and put him into a farm environment. It was a large farm. The man in charge of that farm was a man by the name of Patterson, who was the brother to the principal of Baron Bing.
My mother used to take a room in a house like once in Prefontaine, and then we went for a few years. They'd share a house in Val David. But they went to get away, and their husbands would stay for their week or whatever they had for vacation. And they would come up on weekends, but the train came up, and or there was always somebody they knew with a car who would charge the guys, whatever it is, for a trip here and back.
These people who owned that Castle des Monts, they wanted to, grandioso now, and I had imported a conga drummer from New York, and I had a girl singer, Julita, and she sang and played the maracas and shook her hips and everything, and that was a big hit.
The fact of the matter was, when I came home and got out of the hospital, which was in October of 1947, and decided I wanted to resume life, one of the things that I wanted to do, I was only 27, was to get a date and go out with a girl, go dancing, do something. So I pulled out my little black book. I was funny, I have it in the drawer right here. I looked at it the other day, and I went through the book, and to cut a long story short, every single one of my dates was married. I couldn't get a date, so I went to my kid's sister, and said, could you introduce me to some of your girlfriends? And she said, why? I said, I'd like to have a date. She said, I'm sorry, all my friends are married except 2 who are divorced. So I started from scratch.
So he had to
I didn't know anybody.
Scrape the bottom of the barrel, and there he found me. And that's how it happened.
No, it was, the life had moved on. Among the things that were affected was that kids could contemplate getting married. and couldn't, and their parents would give them money to buy homes. It was a whole different game in 1946 from 1938. Everything was different.
Everybody knew each other. This is before the suburban expansion. Everything was within reach. It wasn't only Shar Shemayan that was close to downtown. So was Spanish and Portuguese in Stanley Street. So was Temple Emmanuel. So was B'nai Jacob. So was the whole congregational development was in arm's length of each other. It was a very compact community.
Then we established ourselves here in at the first house in on Fairmont near Clark. I saved more money, $11,000, to put for a down payment. I bought this house 46 years ago. We're still here in the same house.
When I worked in the Lodge ghetto, next to my workbench was a Czechoslovakian Jew, a very nice, intelligent guy. His name was Otto Czarny. And that Otto, his dream was to survive, live until after the war, and then he said, he straightened himself out and said, and then to lay down somewhere on a beach in Canada. Canada was the dream.